Why does history matter? What's the point in keeping track of everything that's happened before? How does history influence the present and future? The Network State by Balaji Srinivasan makes the case that history is crucial because history is how you win the argument. Winning arguments need more than pure logic alone. You need facts, so you need history. How history determines legality, how history determines morality, how history is how you develop compelling media, how history is the true value of cryptocurrency, and how history tells you who's in charge. We explore how new network states should treat or teach their history, and whether their on chain records make it impossible to lie. We also dive into what history tells us about how radical truth, honesty, and transparency would work at scale using examples from companies doing it today. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Network State Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about why history is crucial. Pretty exciting for this episode. Raf, how do you feel?
Oh, I'm very excited. You know, I'm a big history buff, so
This is all up in your jam.
this is
Um,
mostly my jam.
so this is actually part of, I believe, chapter 2. I'm going to be going ahead and sharing that for everyone to see here. So this is on history as trajectory. Last episode, we covered the prologue. And in this episode, we're going to be covering the next steps. So we covered all of this. And now we're here. Why history is crucial. So there's a couple main points that Balaji makes here. The first one is history is how you win the argument. You simply can't win an argument against such people on pure logic alone. You need facts, so you need history. And so I think this is just pretty straightforward. I don't know if, Raf, you have anything else to add to that. But to me, it's just saying, this is a point of objective truth that we can point to as an example of what happened, and therefore we can use it to determine what is true moving forward.
hmm Yeah, I guess for me, it's always a question of what is that mechanism which decides what is the truth, and is the mechanism for uncovering the truth also working the way that it should, and how much oversight that has. Like how much is the argument you're trying to make playing on what that history actually is about, and how much is the history influencing the argument? Because actually, I don't think those things are it's not like there's a hard wall between the two of them. But I think we get into that into the. I think right now he's just establishing that there's a relationship between these two things, and so I think that's fair, and we get into that later in the document anyway.
Okay, cool. So the next one is that history determines legality. The reason is that behind every FDA, there is a thalidomide, just as behind every TSA, there is a 9/11, and behind every Sarbanes-Oxley, there is an Enron. And so regulation is dull, but the incidents that lead to regulation are anything but dull. And so, I think this just illustrates how without the foresight that history provides, these massive incidents that are hugely negative for the world would just continue happening. And so we need these markers to tell us, hey, there's a flaw in the system and you need to fix it or change the system so that this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, exactly. For me, this is one of the strongest points here, and not only because I find that there's people who like history also actually end up liking law a lot. At least that's what I found from my personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
But it also is that like law is built in a way, especially if the law is not strictly constitutional, but also um, based on like what's previously come out, then that tradition of how have we cut through case laws, like basically case law, how have we cut one way in the past, and how does that affect the law going forward? I mean, that is history, right? That's the way that history evolves. That's the way a nation's law evolves. And so the idea that we should look at history because it determines laws is absolutely correct. And I think that's really interesting. And the cases he brings out are those extreme cases that we know of in recent times. But it would be true even from like a nation building or an empire building from 200 years ago, or even I imagine even thousands of years ago. If we're thinking of like Hammurabi's code, an eye for an eye, and so on. You know, what happened in their history that it got to that point.
Yeah,
And if you know that, then you understand the law, basically. And so I think those two things go hand in hand, and it's really cool that that is one of the first arguments that we have for why we should care when you're trying to set up your own nation, which is
love
you
it.
have to see what other people have gone through to know what's best.
And why things are set up the way that they're set up, right?
Particularly if you
Okay,
want to change them, of course.
right, exactly. So next is history determines morality, and in summary here we have the tales of the distant past, fictionalized or not, that describe how you humans once behaved and how they should have behaved. There's a moral to these stories, right? So, I mean, oldest example would be how the earliest humans would tell stories to each other, either as a warning or as entertainment or as whatever, but there's always some value judgment that's being made by the person listening to determine, was this good, was this bad, and how should I organize that in my moral compass moving forward, right? And then we see obviously things like the Bible and the Quran and the Torah, and how they are the most famous examples of sharing these moralistic stories that have these lessons to teach us how to behave.
Definitely. I think those texts themselves also don't position themselves as strictly historical texts. I don't think anybody makes that argument. And yet it's so interesting how, history is obviously a part of establishing that ethical doctrine, as you said. And I guess in terms, even if you take the other extreme, so like here's religion on one side, and the other extreme is like pure entertainment. Or let's take, for example, the Marvel movies, even though I think some people see that as in and of itself also a religion. But there you go. Like there is a cast of characters. It's yeah, maybe the moral lesson is like good versus evil, and you have certain nuances within there where you have to make a choice. Usually, it's to save a certain amount of human life, although there does seem to be a lot of casualties
Mhm.
in those films, regardless. But what it gets accepted as entertainment is, as you said, like there is an underlying value that connects the viewer to the story that's happening on the screen. Well, when someone watches a movie, it's very easy to imagine that you're that character, or at least you're living with that character in that story, and therefore you're sort of offloading some kind of own personal pressure and putting it on the screen and living that story and sort of going through those motions. And that would only work if you felt like that person represented you ethically as well. Um, Otherwise, their story doesn't really matter, and you would probably
Totally.
disconnect from that story.
Right. But it's kind of interesting in that, there are so many compelling anti-heroes, and that seems to be a more and more popular genre. Um, and so it kind of, makes you wonder with the superhero movies, people, I think, originally were so compelled by them because they were just like these larger than life, infallible uh, figures, or the representations of like the best sides of human nature. But more and more, we're seeing these antagonists become popular, and they're showing flaws that are relatable, right? And so people connect with the story a lot more, and see themselves, like you're talking about, in the story, and that makes them more invested. But it also is just kind of sharing truth, right? And sharing morality as a part of that, because the reasons why, I had to think of some good examples, but why people are fascinated by like Heisenberg in Breaking Bad, or by Khaleesi in Game of Thrones, is because um, they're captivating. In some ways, they throw you off, right? And they almost allow you. It's kind of interesting. I'm just making these dots now, but they allow you to judge them, and to tell yourself like, oh, well, I wouldn't have acted that way, right? And
Mhm.
so it's again just using uh, that moral compass and feeling like you're making some kind of value judgment on them, and deciding in your head or compartmentalizing, is this good behavior, is this bad behavior, Should I do more of it? Should I do less of it?
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on there. I would add that the the idea of an anti-hero I don't think is new. I think it's probably even I don't know if it's classical, but you have uh you may even have anti-heroes in the Bible or in biblical terms. If I don't have an example off the top of my head, but what the anti-hero or I mean, strictly speaking, I'm not sure if it's an anti-hero, but someone who's on that moral gray area, or even on the coming from the other side of morality, there's still a journey there. So, like you said, you're sophisticated. The watcher should be sophisticated enough. The viewer should be sophisticated enough that they can like say, oh yeah, like that's a mere argument, and I'm taking this position. So you can still be as long as you know what your position is and you care about your position, either in opposition or with, then you should still be able to be taken through those stories. And I guess the greatest thing about Breaking Bad is the story was awesome. Until the very end, we were sort of like, well, how far will he go in this
Exactly. Yeah.
absolute argument? And so there you go. So again, I mean, we've jumped off a little bit off of histories per se, but fictionalized, not fictionalized, yeah, you're seeing there is a structure which is let's get how can we understand, how can we connect the dots, and are those dots are just the way that we're connecting dots because we have to connect dots to understand the story, are those not already dictating the way that we should be thinking, or what we're thinking about is actually coming clear from connecting those dots? That's that in and of itself being a moral choice is yeah, I think you could probably make the argument for all stories.
Totally.
And I
And
don't know to what extent there are like I guess the thing is today it's very easy for us to be in our own culture bubble. So it's hard to know, how far what variations of moralities are out there that are being captured in stories versus, what Hollywood is putting out. And you can, maybe it's a category of 16 different larger themes, right? Just throwing a random number out there. But maybe what's interesting for a society is well, actually, history has this morality that's being told, and then it has an individual morality that isn't being told and that's not being captured in the stories, and we want more of that. Or maybe there are moralities that over time, because we lose their history, we also lose what they believed in and what that made up. So that's also an interesting point I wanted to throw in there. The
okay. And
untold true stories, basically.
right. And there's definitely more to touch on there. I'm sure we're going to get into it when we get to media. But the next point here is that political doctrines are based on history lessons too. They're how the establishment justifies itself. And I would add, especially using the press, which we're going to dive into some more. But so this is why this is so important for, just your average person on the day to day, because these lessons, these stories, are being used by people in power to influence your perception of what is good and what is evil, and how does your company or your country stack up on the moral scale of who's best and who's worst, and who's the enemy and who's the good, right? And form your opinion around them. And so one like really poignant example that I think a lot of Americans are not aware about, that I recently became aware about, is how the United States during the Korean War basically carpet bombed 70% of North Korea, like absolutely destroyed it. And that's not something that you're taught in American school, obviously. And it's obviously a massive tragedy. And it's why North Koreans are so hostile towards Americans to this day, right? In their museums, it's painting this picture of, remember the time, right, where the US Army came and literally destroyed the vast majority of our country. And this is what they're using to then influence their country and their citizens to hate the United States. And the United States is using that history to completely hide it and manipulate the perception of the average American citizen that we're the good guys, right? And we don't do any wrong. And it's just so clear that it's much more complex than that. And there's so many different countries that have a very different story to tell. And without full transparency, it's easy to see how each of these individual countries manipulate their citizenry.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a tragic example, and just one of many, particularly from the US in the last 70 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
When when you're dealing with an enemy like the Soviet Union, I think there's a lot of things. The Yeah, basically when your opponent is threatening for nuclear annihilation, there's a lot. Eventually, there's a lot that can get swept under the carpet just to hold up against that kind of thing. Not that that's a justification, but just that I'm sure we're going to keep uncovering every day worse and worse things as it's been doing. And there are people who are viewed as alternative or counter culture who like bring up those points, who have that information, and shake up those moments, like what we saw with the Vietnam War by the end of it. So that that was a moment where history was playing out live, because the facts were being fed live, and it was shaking the preconceived notions or established narrative in the country, which is kind of interesting. But in any case, it's here, I guess the point really is that, like, if if politics, basically once you add politics into the mix, you're instrumentalizing history and turning it into another institution, basically, that is feeding into whatever it is that you're building. Politics is an institutionalized sort of power game, and so
Totally.
history just becomes another thing, another institution that is supposed to mirror whatever is the goal or progression loop, we'll say, of that political institution. And same thing with media, as you said, is like whoever's reporting on that, the relationship with history, the relationship with media, relationship with politics, is how do you strengthen those institutions. And so politics, which is a game of power, really wants that to be as clear and as foundational for its power as possible.
And I think, why this is so interesting and relatable and relevant to network states is because, so looking at the example of like Cuba, a lot of Cubans, probably the vast majority, feel like they've been through communism, they tested it out, they didn't like it, and they don't want to go back to that ever again, right? At least today. And so with the USSR, with Maoism, with Leninism, right? We need to look at these different experiments of how did these countries choose to run? How did these political ideologies choose to implement themselves in the society? And what were the results of that, right? This is an experiment, right? Leninism was definitely different than Stalinism, which is definitely different than Maoism, but they're all rooted in communism. And those are all different from, Fidel Castro in Cuba. But these experiments had very dire results in many cases. And so the US can use that as a case using history to say, we're capitalistic, right? And it does all the time, because look at communism and look at all these horrible things that happen, right? Instead of like, okay, if you're starting a new country from scratch, right? We've got three political ideologies that seem to be contenders: capitalism, socialism, communism, right? And there's obviously way more than that, but that's like the general three options. And instead of the US saying, well, communism is so bad, that's why we're capitalistic, they could theoretically, if they're thinking from first principles, be like, well, here are the elements of capitalism that work really well. Here are the elements of socialism that work really well. Here are the elements of communism that work really well. How do we come across a new system that brings whatever sorts of these elements together to come up with something really powerful? And this is exactly how China is currently doing it, right? So they found these are the aspects of communism that we really like, and I'm speaking as the Chinese government here, right? We can manipulate the people very easily, right? We can centralize all the information. We can choose to control all aspects of our citizens' lives by controlling all the apps that they use on a day-to-day, right? So WeChat is responsible for like pretty much everything, their communication infrastructure, their payment infrastructure, right? They've got AI surveillance everywhere, so they know exactly who you are, what you're doing, and this social standing points getting deducted, very much as the Black Mirror episodes have shown. But they've adopted an economic capitalism that has allowed them to become an economic powerhouse and a rising world power, right? And so they're more pragmatic about their approach, and it has shown, at least in the success metrics of the world today, that if they adopt the right things economically, since that's how most country success is currently measured, they're at the top, right? They're rising, and ain't nobody stopping them. So yeah, China's on the rise, and that's why
hear ye.
yeah, it's a very interesting shift where now people are treating the political doctrines much more pragmatically than ideologically as they were. And my assumption is there, and before jumping into your thoughts here, Raf, that it's a prisoner's dilemma in which every country has to compete, because if they don't compete, someone else rises to power, and now they don't have control, or they don't have sovereignty, or they don't have the safety that they're looking for, right? So everybody's stuck in this prisoner's dilemma. Like, if we don't do this, then they're going to do it. And if they do that, we're not going to like it, right? So yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, before jumping into that prisoner's dilemma, I mean, I think the argument between communism, socialism, or capitalism is a good illustration of that. It really makes me think of what seems to be a central question in US today, particularly in politics, is democracy ... like the best system? And I think this is something on a lot of people's
Right.
minds, even at the highest echelons of our state system in the US, but even abroad. And you look at, and I think the argument is made basically with China. I mean, which is just that, look, China get things done, I guess. And the way they do this through massive control measures and like oppressive system, but not just like physically, but really mentally as well. As someone who's lived there for 8 years, it's an impressive, yeah, it's an impressive vibe that you get when you're in China versus when you leave China. And as much as I enjoyed my time there, but yeah, the question today is like, well, okay, how reliable is the democratic system? I think the US has another issue, which is just like, how is the democratic system really democratic? And that's something else. But as you're building your own network state, to what extent do you give people power, and how is that power justified? That's really interesting. And what does it feed? Those conversations, and I'm sure you have them in political science classes, but you don't really have them in a healthy and normal way in most countries on a public forum kind of space,
That's a great point, right? Back to these moral judgments and how this affects your day-to-day life. If you're an American citizen and you're educated in the US standard public education system, you're not taught communism or socialism in an unbiased way. It's extremely biased, right? It's not, hey, let's learn about how countries run and the pros and cons of each system. It's, this is why capitalism is good, and this is why socialism and communism are bad. And so it's very much influencing the way that you think. And just to touch on what you were saying earlier, right? I think what you're talking about is something that Balaji talks about a lot as well, which is it's American anarchy versus Chinese control, right? And so by anarchy, he's talking about the extreme of this liberal democracy, right? And Chinese control is more like Chinese imperialism and centralization of everything. And so it's, if you look on either end of that spectrum, they can both go into very negative routes. but there is a lot of middle ground there that needs to be explored. And I think actually even just looking at it as a spectrum is the problem, right? Instead of looking at it as kind of a basket where you're picking and choosing the things that work for the societies within your country, or the groups or neighborhoods or buildings or families within your country, that it works for the best, right? Because ultimately, nobody, in my opinion, nobody living in New York City, for example, should have a say about how somebody in Texas is living their life. If you want to affect the way that they're living their life there, live there, right? Be a part of that community. But it doesn't make sense to impose your values and your moral compass on another individual and think that yours are superior for whatever reason. Especially if your life has no impact on theirs, or you're not sharing the same resources, or you're not living the same day-to-day lives. So I don't know, like when it comes to that, the answer seems to be, let's find a system that works for the groups, or not even, I think that's actually another heuristic that I'm falling into here, because we're thinking about how does the government decide what's best, instead of how does the citizen decide what's best for them, right? And how do we give them the most amount of options, and then let it be an idea meritocracy, right? Where the best ideas win, right? And each person is still free to choose what they would prefer. And I think ultimately that's, if we extrapolate what the end of this network state road looks like, if it works, right, is people get to choose easily and frequently what they enjoy the most and what they want to be a part of the most, and support that, but change when their mind changes, which is a good thing, because that keeps it competitive. That allows for more options to exist, and for more people to have the choice to do what they want and live the lives that they want.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting when we fall into that. What could it look like? Because practically, it's such a there's so many factors there. But if you're tuning in now, you can listen to our first podcast, which explains a little bit more in detail what the network state actually is, and how far this could go, which is really cool.
So I want to introduce the next quote here, because this is very relevant to what we're just talking about here. So this right here, so you get a totally different society if 99% of people allocate their limited moral memory to principles like hard work, good; meritocracy, good; envy, bad; charity, good, than if 99% of people have internalized nostrums like socialism, good; civility, bad; law enforcement, bad; looting, good, right? And so you can try to imagine a scenario where these two sets of moral values aren't in direct conflict, but empirically, those with the first set of moral values will favor an entrepreneurial society, and those with the second set of values will not, right? And so it just goes to show right here in this very like simple example, these values have such a dramatic impact in what is valued in that society, and that has an impact on what roles its citizens want to adopt, and that has an impact on its global power, and that has an impact on what that country gets to decide for itself and the rest of the world, if they're the ones setting the world order. So these small, tiny moral judgments that we make on a day-to-day have a direct connection to who ends up in power and decides the trajectory of the global economic path.
Yeah, I mean, I think here I really like actually the first part of that quote, which is so I'm going to bring that in, and then we can play off those two each other, which is the installation of these moral premises is a zero-sum game. And what he means by that, as he explains, is there's only so much room for so many moral lessons in one society. After some point, you just can't hit more ideas, and hence the idea that you need to like have this hierarchy of morality. And I think that that is the same just that for me is already actually kind of a moral statement. But I wonder if that also doesn't underlie, and the point I'm trying to get to is that yeah, it's a competitive space regardless. So just as you will be competing on what are the moral lessons that you want to have, obviously how those are set are really important. But I find that if you believe that they are the moral lessons, hierarchy is a competitive one, then that also leads to thinking that nation states should also live in competition, even more in competition, which we touched on by saying, you know, like I think this is an idea in international relations that we would call like realism, which is that, you know, if you're not acting in the space, if you're not the big guy sort of carrying the big stick, if you will, or having enough to sort of back up, you know, your borders, your culture, your
Mhm.
resources, your people, then you will be steamrolled by a neighbor or another force. And that's just, and that is the law of the game on some level. And obviously this was a founding principle of US thought in the middle and of the last century, through to well into Nixon. And then we had reactions to that being like, well, no, the fact that there are states agreeing to exist in this one space means that there are rules that go beyond pure competition, because we're having states that, you know, if it was purely competitive, shouldn't be existing. Maybe I think that's the extent of the counter argument. And then they say, well, there's both competition and space for hierarchy of rules, which we're trying to agree on. And then you have rise for international institutions like the United Nations, which brings together these states talking to each other instead of just steamrolling each other, right?
Totally.
Obviously, you have situations where there is conflict. So you know there are moments where that realism, that like I'm better than you, therefore I earn this, whatever argument you use, that eventually leads to, you know, that's what the conflict is about. But there is a lot of space before that, which is okay, well, what are we talking about? What do you care about? And where can we exchange? Because actually, those two societies that you mentioned, the hard work good, meritocracy good versus the socialism good, civility bad, there may be an interest in having both of those players in the game because they might actually trade from each other in a way that is interesting. And
Absolutely. Yeah. I think
that's kind of fun.
the the fact that it is a zero sum game, which I think should be analyzed and thought about more, right? Is, are these things really mutually exclusive, and to what
Mhm.
extent? Um, but that's what kind of sets it up um, as a conflict instead of as a collaboration,
Mhm.
and a competition, right? Which in some ways is good and in some ways is bad. All right, so moving on, we have,
Which by the
yeah,
way, there has to be some level of collaboration for competition, because at the end of the day, if you're competing, it does mean you're playing on the same playing field, i.e., you're agreeing to some level of rules. Um,
yes.
if you're not agreeing to some rules, so yeah, so I don't know.
And it's kind of
That's
like
an
whatever they
interesting
can get
direction to
away
go.
with, which actually transitions really nicely into this next point, right? History is how you develop compelling media. You can make up entirely fictional stories, of course, but even fiction frequently has some kind of historical antecedent. The Lord of the Rings drew on medieval Europe, spaghetti westerns pulled from the Wild West, Bond movies were inspired by the Cold War, and so on. And certainly the legitimating stories for any political order will draw on history.
Yeah.
So, you know, why does um, a story like Lord of the Rings or Bond movies uh, have an impact? Because, like we were saying earlier, they're subliminally or not influencing your moral values, and your moral values are influencing your political affiliation. Your political affiliation is influencing the way your country is run, and the way your country is run is influencing where it falls on the rung of power, of global power. So all of these things are tied together. Anything to share on media, Raf?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is also just what are the symbols that are pulled out, because there's a process, you know, like the Lord of the Rings, yes, drew on medieval Europe, but it draws on medieval Europe in many different ways. There's a lot within medieval Europe that you can extract. What is it that the Lord of the Rings took from medieval Europe, which is still relevant to us today? That is the genius of the work.
Mm.
And we see, I mean, it's foundation, it's universal in his approach, because he has this lore, this mythology, which he also sort of derives from an oral tradition, which is the Norse tradition. And then he sets it in a land which resembles the one that that he's dealing with, that he's
To be
familiar with.
clear,
He
we're
adds,
talking about the author, right? Tolkien.
yes, Tolkien, yeah. So whether it's that author or any other author, in the process of creation, whatever they're influenced by within their history, it's still a process of finding out what are those symbols. So, for example, in the Lord of the Rings, choosing to base it off the mythology, off of the oral tradition of Norse or Viking mythology, which we have today, thanks to the Icelandic capturing of that oral tradition through Snorri Snorkelson.
Yeah, it's the funniest name.
Yeah, it's the best name. If in case you've never heard that name, you should look up that. Just it's the prose Edda, and that's the foundation. And that's sort of like the artifact that the Lord of the Rings is higher mythology is referencing, which he then uses for the rest of the world building,
I think that's
which
a
is
really
impressive.
important point, right? Because it's kind of like saying, and something that James Altucher has talked about in the past, uh, there's very rarely new ideas. So I can add one more here, right? Which is Star Wars pulls from Taoism, pulls from the hero arc, right? Pulls from space, and
Mhm,
combines those ideas into something new and compelling. But the moral lessons, right? The arc of the hero, and I believe there's a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell, which
mhm,
dives into how this arc has been used time and time and time again in media to influence people. And with this very compelling arc of a hero, right, that goes through some challenge, overcomes the challenge, and grows as a result. It's a story as old as time,
mhm.
and adding all these other elements to it, right? So with Star Wars and Taoism, that's literally injecting a philosophy into media, which informs the moral values, right? And so um, you see this with a lot of like martial arts movies, right? That have such a strong emphasis on discipline, philosophy, and
Karate Kid.
Karate Kid, exactly, right? And so we can see how media is pulling from these ideologies, and the ideologies have been around for thousands of years in many cases. So it's not like
Mhm.
much has changed there, right? If it's Stoicism, Taoism, maybe even like capitalistic ideologies from early on, right? With trade
And religion, and other
and
like more
religion,
organized religions, from Judaism through to uh, Catholicism,
massively
Protestantism.
so,
Those,
right?
yeah.
Okay, so a lot of
I
influence in media. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I mean, I was just gonna say the the question you have on, like, for example, the hero with a thousand faces is why is it that that narrative of an individual who is supposed to resemble us overcoming a challenge is how is it, or why is that's so foundational or fundamental to the way we relate to
It's a
things,
great
and the
question.
stories that we enjoy? What is it
So
about humanity here that needs to like have this story that we're always sort of being able to, or should be pushed to, or want to hear stories? I think the main point here is actually we actually want to hear, we want to see stories where people overcome challenges. The flip side is when we're watching those movies, we're literally not overcoming a challenge. Which, so it has I think it could have the reverse psychological effect, and I think we see that a lot today also, just with in terms of the influencer content that you see on in social media, that you can focus on other people's lifestyles while not actually going through your own life in any meaningful way. Just as we could see James Bond going to all these incredible places, doing these amazing things, and therefore, your reaction to that is like, oh well, great, that's happened. I felt that, and now I feel inspired. Um, to what extent that changes your life, I don't know, but it does play on a point where it's like, ah, yeah, that's the world that I want to be in. right? At least it
Totally,
sets it up.
exactly. And I think that's ultimately what matters most, right? Because that's what's going to influence your political affiliation, which is what's linked to all those other things, right? So it's really interesting thinking about it just a little bit deeper. Why are challenges so important, or why do we love seeing people overcome those challenges? Dan Ariely, one of the social psychologists at Duke, speaks about this a lot. And from what I remember, the main reason that people feel fulfilled, right, which is a more profound, deep form of happiness, is from overcoming challenges, right? Overcoming the things that they thought were very
Definitely.
difficult, right? And just as humans, right, if we're going back to Maslow's hierarchy, right, that need for fulfillment, that need for meaning, those are at the very top of the pyramid. And so if all the other needs are taken care of, the first thing that we as humans want to focus on is, do we have that meaning? Do we have that fulfillment? And even just watching people overcome challenges gives us, like you said, that dopamine hit of inspiration, like, oh, I got a little sense of meaning and fulfillment from that, but it's short lasted. Actually going through those challenges and overcoming them provides that feeling that's much more lasting. Another idea that's explored extensively in Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Such a good book.
Right. So, these are all fundamental human needs, and they all are tied to why this media is so compelling for us, and how governments or political parties or any influencer uses them to manipulate us in ways, or as propaganda.
Yeah. When we look at history, we want some of those stories because those stories help shape, how we should be acting, which we should be striving for. We should not be overwhelmed by those stories. We shouldn't live in that world, because obviously we live in this world, and hopefully, the state or society that you're living in is helping you to achieve what you're supposed to do. And I guess that's what's put into question with the network state.
Absolutely. All right. And the next point we have here is that history is the true value of cryptocurrency. Right. So Bitcoin is worth hundreds of billions of dollars because it's cryptographically verifiable history of who holds what BTC. And here he's linking to Read the Truth Machine for a book-length treatment of this concept. So from what I'm getting here, the value of Bitcoin is what it is because it allows everybody who's ever interacted with it to track or see the full ledger of transactions. And so there's no influencing it. There's no changing it. It's there. It's on the blockchain, and everybody can see literally every single transaction that has ever happened from the beginning of its inception to present day. And theoretically, that shouldn't change. And so that's very, very valuable because, like we were talking about at the very beginning with, why is history, or how you use history to win the argument, it's a source of objective truth, right? But as we just went over in all these last points, it's actually not objective truth if it's being influenced by your government or by the media or by press, which we'll get into. Whereas Bitcoin is just numbers on a ledger, right? Like this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And everybody can see that, and everybody can agree on it because it's immutable.
Yeah, I guess the question today is, why should we care? I don't know if you have an answer to that, but I think that's a fair question. I mean, it's great to know that and again, this is says coming from someone who works in all things Web3, but why are we excited? Why do we care that we have this cryptographically verifiable history of who holds Bitcoin?
So my hypothesis on that is, once we start seeing network states using the same technology to record their history, then it becomes very, very important, because now it's not, oh, we as the US feel ashamed of what we did in North Korea and we want to sweep it under the rug, or we don't want our citizens to know about that because it makes us look bad, it's there, right? And it's publicly viewable and everybody can see it. And more importantly, when it comes to negotiations at the UN, for example, if the UN has this record, right, or everybody has it, right, but they're displaying it during these conferences and they're like, look, guys, this is the truth. Everybody sees it. Everybody agrees on it. Nobody's changed it. This is what happened from this point on, right? It would obviously have to start. And, you know, it's definitely some points that I want to get into next. It's actually in the next point. But well, I guess we should go into that right now, right? So history tells
I was
you.
just gonna say,
Yeah.
I was just gonna say on that point, you can see the different editions of UN, let's say, facilitated treaties. You could actually, one of the things that is fun is you can see how they changed before and after they were ratified, and then also which even you should be able to see even which delegation, i.e., which country or which representative suggested that the language should be toned down here, or that they're missing a clause there. Actually, that's really interesting. That there is a record of that. I don't know how much that is a part of a live discussion. That actually is a really interesting point. And yeah, I guess it's funny because when I hear cryptocurrency, what I get excited about is, yeah, you can come up with different economic models with different definitions of currency, like how currency should act and what it's allowed to do. But the flip side is, yeah, actually, we can also just have a verifiable ledger of, what facts we're considering as a canon, and that process on how that happens is also really interesting, actually. So I really like that angle. So I think that's a good answer. Personally, I think it's a good answer. I don't know, maybe there's other people who are arguing against that.
No, for sure. But okay, so moving on to the next point, right? This is why this is so important. So history tells you who's in charge. Why did Orwell say that he who controls the past controls the future, and that he who controls the present controls the past? Because history textbooks are written by the winners. They are authored subtly or not to tell a story of great triumph by the ruling establishment over its past enemies. The only history most people in the US know is 1776, 1865, 1945, and 1965, a potted history of revolutions, world wars, and activist movements that lead ineluctably to the sunny uplands of greater political equality. It's very similar to the history of the Soviets taught their children, where all of the past was interpreted through the lens of class struggle, bringing Soviet citizens to the present day, where they were inevitably progressing from the intermediate stage of socialism towards communism. And Chinese school children learn a similarly selective history, where the real, in parentheses, wrongs of the European colonialists and Japanese are centered and those of Mao downplayed. And even any successful startup tells a founding story that sands off the rough edges. So in short, a history textbook gives you a hero's journey that celebrates the triumph of its establishment authors against all odds, even when a historical treatment covers ostensible victims, like Soviet textbooks covering the victimization of the proletariat. If you look carefully, the ruling class that authors that treatment typically justifies itself as the champion of those victims. This is why one of the first acts of any conquering regime is to rewrite the textbooks to tell you who's in charge. And so through all this, it's just kind of summarizing everything that we just talked about. My follow-up questions were, how will these new network states treat/teach their history, right? Will the on-chain records make it impossible to lie? Certainly, you can lie about the data, but you can't lie about the data, but you can still teach certain stories that can influence that data's interpretation, right? Especially for young, impressionable students. And this is something that we've seen with religion really well, right? The unchangeable data is the Bible, or is the Quran, or is the Torah. But the interpretation of that data, of those texts, is splintered off into infinite ways. And so then it just goes right back to who has the most compelling hero's journey story that influences the most people in the most effective ways. And so I don't know that it will change the ways that humans interact or learn. I think that's so hardwired into us from, tens of thousands of years of history that we will always be susceptible to the emotions and the inspiration of a good story. We just love learning that way. But given a more advanced society with a immutable ledger of what actually happened, will that be enough to remain logical or impartial enough to be fair, right? Because that's what it comes down to during these UN talks, or with any diplomacy from country to country. If you don't have some verifiable form of objective truth that you guys can both agree on before you start talking about it, you're not going to get anywhere, right? You see that fighting with friends or with your partner or with anybody. If you don't share the same set of facts, right? We can't agree on the facts. The conversation isn't about finding a middle ground. It's just, I feel this way and I want you to feel the same, or vice versa. And it doesn't really get anywhere. And we've seen how that has, polarized the US into the left and the right, and in many other countries as well.
Yeah. I mean, I really enjoyed that breakdown, Adrian.
Cheers.
I think yeah. I one point within that, I guess, is what is that process of choosing? What makes it as truth, or what makes it as the facts? And yeah, maybe the information you put onto the blockchain is itself immutable, but how do you choose what to put on the blockchain?
Totally.
Is a whole other story, and who approves that process? I think what I love is that this really gets us down to this question of like, what is truth? And is there an objective truth? I mean, the premise is if there's one immutable ledger with a process which reflects the objective of, for example, generating objective truth, maybe that's a network state manifesto there.
Exactly.
Then suddenly you have one law, one story. I mean, the potential is really impressive and comes so close to utopian sort of thought processing, which is interesting. But how do you get there, and what makes it? Yeah, I mean, on one side, like you said, there's this emotionality that we get sucked into, which then, I guess, undercuts objectivity. And then if that feeds into the process, then you're going to be off the mark, basically, whatever you put on there. So it's interesting to know what are those guideposts that network states might want to come up with to gear, if again the objective is some kind of objective truth. If the goal is an objective truth, then what's the guidepost for generating objective truth and capturing that and having that approved?
I think so. This is actually one of the questions I had as well, right? I think it's the most fascinating one because it comes down to our human nature to decide, do we want to track everything? How much do we want to track? And it's kind of this privacy versus truth argument. And so,
which some people might want to opt in. That might be a network state.
Exactly. So I think ultimately it's going to come down to choice, right? You as an individual get to decide which network state you want to be a part of and see how it functions. And so then the follow-up to that, right, is will the data be made private in some? Will it be public in others? And then looking at what does history tell us about how radical truth, honesty, right, radical transparency work at scale. The only example that we have is a very small example. It's not at scale, but it's Bridgewater Associates, the company run by Ray Dalio, where these are like key tenants, right? Of everything is monitored, everything is logged, everybody sees what everybody thinks during meetings, and everybody can vote on that, right? There's a book called Radical Honesty by Dr. Brad Blanton, which also gives us a brief preview about what that could look like on your day-to-day. And there was a great article in Esquire written by I don't remember the author's name, but if you just Google Radical Honesty Esquire, it'll come up. Who read Dr. Brad Blanton's book and decided to live a radically honest life, meaning just being honest about absolutely everything for 6 months, and explain how that affected his relationships, how it affected his work,
Isn't
how it
that
affected all these different things.
I think that's the premise for like 2 or 3 different Jim Carrey films at this point.
There you go, right? So we can see, or I think a lot of people would agree that some level of privacy is necessary, and a lot of people would agree that some level of secrecy is required. Either if it's you're making the national security argument, or you're making just the not hurting people's feelings argument. It doesn't really matter. Some level of those exist. And so I think it's going to come down to, what do the founders value, and what do the citizens of that network state value, and how do they vote on these different issues to determine, okay, well, this level of privacy is important to us. And maybe it breaks down into small segments within each network state, just like that happens in the United States, with each state making their own statewide regulation, right? So I think, yeah, ultimately it has to come down to the people and for them to decide for themselves.
Yeah, I think opting into any sort of tracking, you have to believe that the payoff is going to be worth it also. And I wonder, what is the promise that a company, for example, is doing, or a network state? Like, once you get that to scale, what is the payoff that you can give to people at scale that is interesting, that is something people would want to opt in, as you say? Because I think you should be able to, and you can opt in. In fact, it feels very much like just making certain belief systems explicit, like, oh, are we being watched? Is this whether this is just the matrix, or there's a religion and you believe in an ultimate power, in both of those senses, there's rules to the game. You choose to play by them or not. But at scale, it's like, what's the payoff for people who are, like, for the mass that would want to be opting into that?
So I'm
I think
thinking
that's kind of
of,
interesting.
yeah, the analogy between health wearables, like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or an Oura Ring, right? That's pulling all of this biometric data about its users and logging it, right? And so I can see a world in which, and it's pretty terrifying, but I can see a world in which the United Nations or a equivalent organization implements these types of wearables for each country or each network state, right? That automatically reports on the health, right? And the other metrics, climate being one of them, to determine what is true. And it's all verified on a blockchain, right? So if we're talking about sustainability as the main issue in the UN, right? And these countries are coming to the table saying, like, well, we don't want to switch from gasoline just yet, because we haven't had our full use of it, and everybody else has gotten their full use of it, and it allowed their countries to accelerate so much, so we want to use it more, right? Okay, cool. Where do you mathematically fall where, okay, China's carbon emissions can be X, the US's can be Y, France's can be Z, and we are going to track and monitor all of that with these wearables that are tied to each of your production plants, or whatever ways that country already measures it. There has to be some standardized model, right? Because it can't be trusting each individual country, otherwise they're going to influence it whatever ways they want. But that gives it this very powerful overall data set, and it cannot be owned by a single entity, because that's just way too much power in the hands of one organization, but it needs to be owned by the people in some way. And that's what we could then use to hold people accountable, right? So what are the ways that we can track? And yes, of course, there's going to be that back and forth between, well, our country doesn't believe in giving up so much information, right? But if your country is having a dramatic negative impact on the health of the world, of the globe as a whole, where is that middle ground? And so I see, this kind of brings to mind the same realization that astronauts have time and time again when they're going to space and they look back at the Earth and they have this visceral feeling of oneness, right? Where every little fight or conflict that's happening on planet Earth just seems so trivial when looking at this tiny little blue dot in this vast blackness of nothing, right? And it just kind of puts everybody on the same team. And so I think,
by the way, that's it's a meditation exercise you can do also if you ever feel a little bit worked up. Is imagine yourself as that speck outside of the entire world, and that helps you relativize. Crazy.
I
You
love
don't have
it.
to go to space. Is what I'm saying.
Right, exactly. You don't have to go to space, and so we need to find ways to promote that. Not just not because not because of like a communism or a communistic ideology, but just at least a baseline of human rights, right? So like, and everybody's going to fall into their own sensitivities there, and that's fine. But ultimately, if we're trying to move in a positive trajectory, if we're trying to become a multiplanetary species, if we're trying to thrive in peace and happiness for all in some way, right? We need to be collaborative. And it's not going to be on everything, right? Some level of isolationism is good in some ways. And having diversity is good. But if we don't learn to play as a team and we're not willing to share information about how we are contributing to the negative aspects of or the negative consequences to the world, and we're not being honest about that and taking responsibility and owning it, then it's not going to change, right? And so ultimately what I see happening with that is there will be factions, right, which there already are. So like NATO and the European Union and like whatever, all these different kinds of groups of countries that come together and say, well, if you don't play by our rules, then we're going to have these sanctions on you, right? And so you're not going to be able to take advantage of trade, or you're not going to be able to take advantage of whatever it is that you're benefiting from us. And if that's enough of a strong pull, then that gets enough people to fall in line. But it really does come down to, who has the strongest or the most influencing faction to bring all the players together, and not in a malicious, like you're forced to do this kind of way, because that brings us right back to the game theory problem of each company or each country or company being in this prisoner's dilemma. But instead of how do we align everybody's incentives towards the things that we all care about?
Right there, there's a lot there that needs to be unpacked, but I think specifically on I guess on the section that we're looking at, which is that history tells you who's in charge. Taking what you've done, which is going far, both in the theoretical and then also practically showing us, who plays this game and how we do it. I think what ultimately maybe how you would use this in your own network state is just that maybe there's a way where you would want to tell a story that says that you, the individual, is in charge. And that's something that we don't see so much, no matter what level of society you're looking at, whether it's those institutions that you mentioned who are leveraging their power to do whatever it is, or your own domestic politics, or even your interpersonal. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Totally, it does, right?
That's
And
the way I see it. With if you have this opportunity to tell who's in charge, well, why wouldn't you just want to say, like, you're in charge?
right.
And I guess that's the step that we're allowed to do.
So yeah, to wrap up and put a bow on it all, it brings us to this this individualism versus collectivism, and those trace back to, again, these philosophical and moral values that are taught or have been taught through
Thousands
from
of
the
years.
beginning of time, right?
Yeah,
Exactly. And so we need to
And actually
consider.
that's the argument also for the rights when you mentioned rights, but like rights
Yes.
versus responsibility. And I think there's a lot of, okay, you know, let's focus on what your right is, and this, it's my right to do this, my right to do that. But then also, I mean, it's literally the most one of the more beautiful arguments made in American politics, which is the JFK approach, which is that, you know, ask not what America can do for you, but what you can do for America, which I think is that idea in every situation is very powerful. Again, that rights versus responsibility, the individual versus the collective, and knowing that you're in charge is a form of idealism. Turning that into something real is that balance of pragmatism, and I think both sort of hopefully feed onto each other.
Yeah. And we're hoping, right, ultimately to wrap up this episode where some more points and more sub points in history as trajectory and why history is crucial that we'll cover in future episodes. But we'll leave listeners with this thought, right? What is the role of collectivism or individualism for you? And ultimately, if that's what's going to determine what kinds of network states pop up and are successful, what is the makeup globally of those that can work? And on that note, everyone,
Experiment.
yeah, please like, comment, subscribe, share if you enjoyed, follow us on socials, sign up for the newsletter. We got plenty of exclusive perks and fun deals in there. And we will see you next time. All the best.
See you next time.
Thanks for listening. In the next episode, part 2 of why history is crucial and why it matters, we'll talk about how history determines your hiring policy, how history is how you debug our broken society, and finally conclude on why history is useful for startup societies.